Cheik Anta Diops. To describe Cheik Anta Diops, I will try and read the paper, so I'll start now. But that describes Cheik Anta Diops. The ideological struggle to counter the civilizational racist denial of the existence of African philosophy centers around four approaches. First, identified by Olusegun in paper titled Four Trends in African Philosophy. These are ethno-philosophy, professional philosophy, political ideological philosophy, sagacity. Other classifications are by Samuel Luchi Umbo, tripartite scheme of ethno-philosophy, universalist and hermeneutical orientation, and Mundimbe, three approaches of contemporary African philosophy, the critique of ethno-philosophy, the foundational trend, and the hermeneutical approach. However, none of this categorization included the historical perspective championed by Cheik Anta Diops and Theophilus Obenga, that the history and practice of philosophy in Africa predates and is the stolen origin of Greek philosophy, and that African philosophy is intrinsic to and subversive of Western philosophy. Given that the goal of African philosophy should be to generate and create new questions, to make possible new concepts and not be concerned merely with identifying questions that exist. This presentation aims to reopen the questions generated by the works of Cheik Anta Diops in the study of African philosophy. I argue, based on the plausibility of its etymological construction provided by Theophilus Obenga and the logic of its history and historiography supplied by Cheik Anta Diops, that the question of Africa and the African question in philosophy generated by Diop's work ruptures, deconstruct, and reconfigure the foundation of philosophy in its Western universal hegemonic configuration, forcing a new discourse of the history of philosophy and the place of Africa in philosophy. I'll start with a brief explain that three things I'm doing here. First, I will describe Cheik Anta Diops' general thesis. Then I will talk briefly, try to review the chapter I'm talking about. Does an African philosophy exist? Then I'm going to try and put around implication and question raised by Diop's work. And in short, so I will start here. That is one thing. Diop said this statement: the African historian or scholar who evades the problem of Egypt is neither modest nor objective nor unruffled. He is ignorant, cowardly, and neurotic. Why is neurotic is this? Because it's a sense of historical alienation, like a being who does not recognize itself. That is the basic thing. You just don't recognize. You imagine, a chicken is an ego. That is just what is happening. People don't know their history. That's why you find, typically people will stand there and when they talk, if you ask any typical African, say, oh, what side do you stand? Pharaoh or Moses? Everybody jump to Moses. But ideally, you are Pharaoh. So you can see, if you start thinking from that logic, you are displaced already. So Cheik Anta Diops was recognized along with W.B. Du Bois as the first World African Negro Heart, as one of the African intellectuals who had the greatest impact on African thought in the 20th century. He was described as the pharaoh of African history who laid the foundation of a paradigmatic epistemic methodological revolution in African scholarship. Diop was a Pan-African political activist, and his work is copious and deserved equally extensive dissertation. Diop was a physicist, Egyptologist, historian, anthropologist, linguist, philosopher, and political theorist. And what this shows is that Diop approached the study of Africa from an interdisciplinary perspective. That is, it's not like codifying and say you study in Africa in history, in physics. Just interdisciplinary. He's a scientist. He trained basically as a scientist, a physicist who went into history and went to archaeology. So most of his, that's why he said it. He insisted on strict adherence to scientific methodology and warned against taking liberties with scientific truth. Thus, his central objective of restoring the collective African personality relies strictly on scientific interdisciplinary method with explicit political objective. This, according to Diop, was necessary because the political problem of our colonial situation was the impetus for radical scholarship as part of the anti-colonial struggle, with the objective of decolonization in Africa and the restoration of African place in world history. Diop echoed Frank Fanon and Amilcar Cabral's thesis on colonialism as epistemological, cultural, and metaphysical violence on the being of the colonized, when he argued that the negation of the history and intellectual accomplishment of Africa was cultural mental murder, which preceded and paved the way for their subjugation. Diop therefore insisted that the necessary point of departure for the anti-colonial struggle for political liberation should be the terrain of culture and intellectual resistance. Assessing that history, the existence of African history with its own paradigm of knowledge production, Diop argued that one can say people have left prehistory behind from the moment that it has become conscious of the importance of historical events to the point where it invents a technique oral or written, for its memorialization and accumulation. The point was that a people without collective historical consciousness that can ensure its historical continuity and collective survival are merely populations. This, he argues, is because what is important for a given people is not the fact of being able to claim a more or less grandiose historical past, but rather to be simply pervaded by this sense of historical continuity. For Diop, racist scholarship distorted and falsified African history through the discipline of Egyptology. He maintained that Egyptology destroyed the collective historical consciousness of Africa by the excision of ancient Egypt from the history of Africa. And this, all of us can recollect Hegel. Hegel said Egypt is not part of Africa. And you can see the ghost of Hegel still going up. That when you discuss Africa, you have two Africans. There's Africa and there's Sub-Saharan Africa. The Sub-Saharan Africa is just, Egypt is not part of it. So when you think of Africa, you actually think of Sub-Saharan. You never realize that this is Egypt. Geographically, it should be part of it, but historically and culturally, Diop proved that this is an intrinsic part of Africa. This resulted in a distorted cultural historical consciousness among Africans of their true cultural identity. This cultural alienation, due to the distortion of the collective historical consciousness of Africa by deliberate falsification of African role in world history through the excision of ancient Egypt from the rest of Africa, according to Diop, was exemplified in the work of Negritude poet. He used that the sentiment of Senghor, that reason is Greek, emotion is Africa, and for the sentiment of people like Ahmed Cizai, that, oh, clap for the people who never invented everything. It's a sign of historical lack of historical consciousness, because if they are understood who the ancient Egyptians were, they will never, ancient Egyptians, as you will see, are the pioneer in mathematics and science. What we call science today and mathematics started from ancient Egypt. So for somebody like Diop, for somebody like Ahmed Cizai and Senghor to say things like that, it shows the extent of alienation even among the greatest African intellectual. Crucially for Diop, this falsification is like the stealing of the soul of Africa, which can only be retrieved through a scientific approach. Diop's central thesis that the ancient Egyptians were African, and ancient Egyptian civilization was an African civilization was given a tone of spurious tone of authority by Martin Bernard. And this is what Bernard said. I will quickly turn to that. This is what Bernard said. You know, because before Diop stated this thesis long ago, says GGF James has a stolen legacy, but only with Martin Bernard, the black antenna, you then have the culture war. Then people start responding to this thesis. You find Lefkowitz, you find Rogers, they start attacking Diop. And this is what Bernard is a good man. This is what he said. He says, certainly, if a black were to say what I'm now putting in my book, the reception will be different. They'll be assumed to be one-sided and partisan, pushing a black nationalist agenda. But being not only white, male and middle-aged and middle class, but also British in America, has given him a tone of authority that is completely spurious. So what he basically did here, I have to go back. Sorry. How do I go back? Sorry. Diop Central. So I just want to point that out. Yeah, this one. You see, this is that Diop Central thesis. So I'll just go around and read. Diop said again that the Afrikaners. This is before. That's why I'm bringing in Bernard. The Afrikaners of Egyptians was common knowledge among the ancients, which was overthrown in the 19th century for purely racist motive, according to Bernard, in agreement with Diop. Relying on Herodotus, Diodorus of Sicily, and Strabo, and a host of ancient classical writers, in addition to evidence from archaeology, anthropology, linguistic, and scientific evidence, Diop proved that ancient Egyptians were genetically and physiologically the same as contemporary Africans, and that ancient Egypt, in all markers of its civilization, was similar to and originated in African indigenous culture. He maintained that ancient Egyptians were African as a racial category, and ancient Egyptian civilization was not only characteristically African in all its cultural form, but more importantly, it was derived from and sustained by an interior African cultural metaphysical roots. It is for this reason, Diop argued, that black Africa can and must lay claim to this culture, to the cultural heritage of ancient Egyptian civilization, because they are the only ones today whose sensitivity is able to blend easily with the essence of that civilization. According to Obenga, the real face of ancient Egyptian civilization will not be known until the day it embraces ancient Egypt in its native environment. its original content, that is to say, black African world, for the obvious reason that the psychology and culture revealed by the ancient Egyptian texts are identical to those of black Africa. And this is what is difficult. They prove a lot of things, that in proving the connection of African to ancient Egyptian to African civilization, it went through a host of African cultural features, totemism, circumcision, social structure, everything, to show that these are just, they are similar, they are replicated all over the place. And if you have an opportunity to go to a museum and look at everything and look at the meat, it will recollect the meat, average meat you hear in your village that you just discounted. I will get to that. But and then this is very important because Diop is always accused of like racial essentialism. It's black, black, black. But Diop said this, and this is very important, to counter the charge of racial essentialism in his emphasis on blackness as definitive of the connection of Africa to the ancient Egyptians. Diop stated, nature could have presented, and this is it's just chance. So I don't need to, it's chance, it's what happens in biology, it's a fact of biology. It doesn't give you any special authority or any special right. It's just what happened. Because as he explained here, if the first man on Africa had been white, you won't survive. You can see the ultraviolet light. You understand? And so that is what you prove here, that blackness is just a scientific fact. It doesn't confer any superiority or inferiority on anybody. It's just a fact of science. Diop nonetheless maintained that reconnecting ancient Egypt to African history was necessary in order to correct the negative effect of alienation caused by racial distortion. I will skip that. He therefore argued, given the connection of ancient Egypt to African civilization, he therefore argued, and this is his famous dictum, the history of Africa will remain suspended in air and cannot be written correctly until African historians dare to connect it to the history of Egypt. In particular, the study of languages, institutions, and so forth cannot be treated properly. In a word, it will be impossible to build an African humanities, a body of human science, so long as that relationship does not appear legitimate. And what he did was that, how can you study Western history or Western philosophy or anything Western without going to its root in Greek? You just start. Where will you start? Most of the things we know about Western philosophy till now started from Greek. The democracy, everything. So they're always referring to Greek. Imagine the distance of American to Athens. And go to look at America, look at the dollar, and look at till now. And wanting to know what Greece is to look at Greece today. Greece, what has been applied to Africa in the 80s, structural adjustment program, is what Greek has just been tormented. Is what they have just been put through. And why? Because the ethos, if you go to Athens, Greek, the way people act, the way they look at material is very, very African, as against Europeans who are up north, who are just walking and thrift. Live normally. They've had lunch, they spend money, what we call corruption is a way of life in Greece, all these informal businesses. So there's a lot of retention of African features, even in Greece today, and that's why they have that big economic problem. That's why you can see the way they are being treated by the Germans. It's just what Isaiah said. After perfecting colonialism here, all the method of colonialism, they went to apply it to the Jews in Europe. It's the same thing that is happening with Greece today. What is happening is structural adjustment program. This is just an aside to just show the affinity of Africa and Greece. I'll move on to that. Then I'll quickly jump from here. And what is important is that Diop's assertion that the ancient Egyptians were black and the role of ancient Egypt in African history was not new in African historiography. Edward Blyden, Du Bois, Marcus Garvey, William Sluhansbury, Joseph Dangwa, J.M. James, Pixie Semer, all of them, they made this argument. They made similar prior to group. What was new about Diop's claim was that it turned the thesis of ancient Egypt in Africa into an operational scientific principle. True, offering a new epistemological paradigm and methodological direction to the study of Africa. As he himself admitted, the importance of his test was less to have stated the connection than to have contributed to making this idea a conscious historical fact for Africa and the world, and especially to make it a scientific concept. And then I'll quickly jump to his perspective of African philosophy. This is Diop's perspective of African philosophy. Diop laid the question of the existence of African philosophy to rest by insisting that the most scientific way of tracing the evolution of philosophical thought and of characterizing its African variant is through the identification of the chronology of their genesis, that means their origin, and their true historical connection. This historiography of philosophy, Diop demonstrates, reveals that the corpus of philosophy, Pythagorean mathematics, the theory of the four elements of tales of Miletus, Epicurean materialism, Plato idealism, Judaism, Islam, and modern science are rooted in Egyptian cosmology and science. He therefore argued that by renewing ties with Egypt, we soon discover an historical perspective of 5,000 years that made possible the diachronic study on our own land of all scientific disciplines we are trying to integrate into modern African thought. And when I come now, I will try and explain this. For Diop, to become conscious of that historical fact is perhaps the first step toward a genuine retrieval of himself, because without it, intellectual sterility is the general rule, or else the creation bear I don't know what imprint of subhuman. Diop can be polemic. You can see from the very beginning. Thus, Diop's answer to the question, does an African philosophy exist, hints on the insistence of the connection of African intellectual tradition, cosmogonies, and ancient Egyptian thought. Diop's work, according to Abiola Irele, demonstrates the continuity of ancient Egyptian civilization in the traditional culture of contemporary Africa. Diop demonstrated that African as the interior of the continent, like the Greek, were initiated to different degrees of Egyptian philosophy, which explained the numerous similarities and connection and continuity between these cosmogonies, which he argued could not stem from chance, but which re-established clarity and rationality. As pointed out by Modimbe, V.Y. Modimbe, Diop's work constituted part of the most prudent undertaking in 1940 re-evaluation of the history of the continent. It was concerned with connecting the history of the rest of Africa to ancient Egypt, rather than preoccupation with Egypt's influence on Greece. And this is important too. Why Martin Bernal and the whole debate have been Egypt and Greece. Diop went backward, and this is what Morakinyo said we should do. Diop said, what is the connection of ancient Egypt to African cosmogony and culture? So we're coming back, but before it had been, what Greece, Egypt influenced Greece. No. What is the relation between Egypt and the rest of the continent? That is what Diop main focus. And he tried to trace it through the study of languages, the study of artifacts. And that's why I say, as soon as you understand this, it's like you have a new consciousness. Imagine, people think South Africa is very far to Egypt. But you can geographically, and all of us can know now, you can study geography. Where is lion in Egypt? Where do you think, where can lion is not natural, it's not by nature in Egypt. Gold, where is the gold mines? Where are the gold mines up north? The gold comes from here. If you study your geography, you can just look at down here, the monsoon that go from Mozambique up north. You just have to know the time to sail. The wind blows you down here and takes you back here, just from on this Indian Ocean. So you can see that things like Great Zimbabwe, everything is known to the Egyptians, because they will tell you about pygmies that come dance up north. And we've never known where Pont or all those places are now till today. Certainly, and then I'll quickly jump here. Interestingly, I'm jumping now. Interestingly, this is what Diop said. Our young philosophers should, but interestingly, Diop's perspective of African philosophy was categorized by Samuel Mbo as ethnophilosophy because of his insistence on the existence of a fundamental cultural unity among the different African cosmogonies. By tracing their historical and conceptual connection to ancient philosophy, Diop provides what Abiola Irele calls a scholarly erudition to ethnophilosophy and offers a deeper understanding of its concept, which rehabilitated the ethnophilosophy of Father Temples and Alex Kagame. He nonetheless criticized them for projecting a thought that fails the most basic criteria for any system of thought to be considered philosophy, that it must be conscious of itself and of its own existence as thought. Remember, the Bantu philosophy of Father Temple. The beholder doesn't know. You say it's not that this philosophy I'm telling you, if you go and meet any Bantu, he doesn't know. Only through Father Temple as what you call the patronizing father, he's able to, this is what you think, then he's able to systematize it. That is one thing. Diop argued that the system of thought of which the opponent is early aware cannot be considered philosophy. As he stated, certainly during pre-colonial epoch, when they were intensely lived, I don't think I have to quote that, it's up there, they were close to self-conscious thought, but they have since become degraded, fossilized, and it will be excessive to take them for a philosophical system at this point in time. I will come back to why African cosmogony were degraded, because at the same time the Greeks were being inducted into Egyptian philosophy. Africans were at the same time being inducted into it, but our own system of knowledge production is faulty. It is by selective initiation. You get what I mean? So the more is selective, it's not like broad, but you have to be. That's why most Egyptian philosophers are priests. So it's the religious concept of it. And this is the main distinction. The only thing Greek act to Egyptian philosophy, as I will come to, is the atheistic materialism. They remove God
away from all these concepts and actually deal with it according to matter. Meanwhile, in Egyptian, it's always, that's the way of life, is God. The spiritual component was never lost. That is the difference. Diop described the ethno-philosophy debate as a bogus debate because of the lack of attention to its historicity. He said that it is essential to break away from a temporal structural study of African cosmogony, because by isolating oneself from historical framework, one becomes exhausted in the first battle without knowing it. Because what are you going to argue? You argue based on what? Just analytic. There is no historical content to it. Things don't, and this is the main difference. What Diop adds to African philosophy and study is the importance of history. This is what Marx adds added to the whole. This is the most important thing in Marx philosophy: history. Like in Diop, to history is very important to Diop. And then he went on according to him, we can only build a body of discipline in the humanity by legitimizing and systemizing the return to Egypt. In the course of this account, we will see that only Egyptian facts allow us to find here and there the common denominator of the remnants of thought, a connection with African cosmogony in the place of fossilization. As soon as we make this connection, ethnophilosophy, this connection of African cosmogony and ancient Egyptian philosophy according to Diop, we will realize that, as stated by Obenga, the revelation of Ogotimeli, which I will call Ogotimeli is Dogon. That conversation with Ogotimeli is a big word by Marcel Gray. What Marcel Gray did was to have a conversation with Ogotimeli is blind, they have never been to school. And it stated very deeply, not only deep philosophy, but it discussed the style of Cyrus. You understand? And it's only now that we have been able to confirm that what exactly the style of Cyrus is discussing is the same thing you find in modern science. And even it's called the tiniest and heaviest star. They call it the Digitara, they call it. And this has been proved by science again. You understand? It is, to this extent, you can see that Marcel Gray should be around maybe 1945, I don't know. There was a very old book. Marcel Gray is a French philosopher who interviewed Ogotimeli, and he had a partner, and he wrote a lot of things on it, so you can Google Ogotimeli. And as the derivation of Ogotimeli of Bantu philosophy turns out to contribute precious information which help us better understand crucial aspects of Egyptian thought and its relationship to African cosmogony and the utilitarian significance of this fact, as demonstrated by Diop in his comparison of the Go philosophy and Bantu philosophy. The concept of vital force and the Bantu philosophy concept of vital force, only the Egyptian fact allows us to find a common denominator between African cosmogony and the Egyptian fact. Then this is a very, very brief review I'm doing on chapter 7, because the question is, does an African philosophy exist? In this chapter, Diop answered the question of the extent of African philosophy by showing how, through historical and linguistic comparative methods, the origin and development of philosophy in ancient Egypt and its connection and relationship with African cosmogony and Greek philosophy. What Diop basically did was is a three process of comparison. He compared Egyptian philosophy to African cosmogony, and then he went ahead and compared this Egyptian cosmogony to Greek. And he focused on Timaeus and Plato's metaphysics. You understand? And it showed the relationship, because this what we see in this African cosmogony translated into Egypt, we can just find it in Plato and in Aristotle. It makes that connection, so I would advise people to actually look at that. It demonstrates the interconnectedness of contemporary African philosophy to ancient Egyptian philosophy and Greek philosophy, focusing on Plato, Timaeus, and Aristotle physics. Starting with a bit, then I will quickly jump there. But this I think is important. In discussing, because I mentioned Dogon earlier, but it focused on, it started with discussing, because after saying this is Egypt, he said, into this black African. Because remember, what Diop was saying is that this ancient Egyptian cosmogony is still active. It's what we just walk past every day. It's Bantu philosophy, it's Ubuntu. It's like we don't take, it's like we think it's not knowledge. But a deeper understanding, connecting it to Egypt, will let you see the bigger significance of this concept. But he said this thing. In discussing the most important aspect of the Dogon cosmogony, the advanced scientific feat of recognition of the stars of Sirius, Diop made a very important remark concerning key problems of knowledge production and transmission in Africa. According to him, the practice